Turn it down if you're offering. It's good to be home. Good to see everyone. I'll tell you something. I may share this again later because I'll probably forget that I already told you. Especially the state of mind I'm in right now. We had a whirlwind, week-long trip to Costa Rica. And I knew it was going to be busy and a lot packed in, but there was even more packed in than I realized. Because I didn't realize there was going to be a seminar each night. But Dave, poor old Dave's not feeling sorry for me because Dave had to speak for the seminar every night. He got to teach the same material he was teaching to the second-year students, but the seminar course was open to everybody, anybody that wanted to come. And so even though he was teaching the same material, he's still teaching, and that's it's a different kind of tired. I always tell people, but it is very exhausting. But just to get out of the school every day, and sometimes we didn't have any break at all. Sometimes we'd go home just to pick up a few people to give them a ride and then take off straight to the church building. Of course, the church building takes about an hour and a half to get there, around 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It takes an hour and a half to get there. On Sunday morning, it takes about 20 minutes. That's the traffic in San Jose. I was telling Robert and Chris this morning that Atlanta traffic has not got much, if anything, on San Jose. So a lot of days we would, in a couple of days there was a Bible study at 6, an evangelistic study. So it would just be get out of school, go home just long enough to pick up a couple of people, back on the road again. But I love, of course I want to learn Spanish, and I tell people I've learned a lot of words, but that's a far cry. When you know a lot of words, it's a far cry from speaking. And it's interesting because you get down there and you hear it so much, and I feel like every time I make a trip to Costa Rica, I take a big giant step ahead, but then you come home and for the next few months you speak English nonstop, and you take a giant step back. But I love idioms. Idioms in any language, of course, are phrases that literally make no sense at all. I love messing with Hainer, with English idioms, and especially Southern idioms, but I also love learning theirs and their language, and they, of course, like any language, have ones. But an idiom in English, a perfect example is "it's raining cats and dogs." That makes absolutely no sense, literally, but it's a figurative expression we use. And the first time we said that to Hainer in Nicaragua in 2016, he was just. It came a rain one day, and I said, "Man, it is raining cats and dogs." And he's like, "What?" But they have these expressions too, and we say it's drizzling or sprinkling, and they say pelo de gato, which literally translates to cat hair. And I asked Hainer, I said, where do you get this? And he says, like cat hair, beep, 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 beep. And it's the sprinkles, cat hair. I said, okay. So but I learned a new one this trip. It's somebody says, "How are you? How are you doing?" And you say, "Estoy a cachete." And it means literally 2 cheeks full. But it's their way of saying, Dave and Nikki and I, we have figured out a fairly equivalent Southern expression. I'm finer than frog's hair split 3 ways. That's about the equivalent in Southern English. But that's their expression for it. It's like you're at a good meal, and you just got both cheeks full of food, and you're just chowing down, and life's good, But I learned that, and they thought that was so funny to hear a gringo say. I walked up yesterday morning at the airport, and the lady greets me. Of course, all the Delta people at the airport speak English. And she says, "And how are you doing in English?" And I said, "Oh, estoy a cachete." And she just giggled and laughed. I never failed to get someone to laugh. And so I finally asked Sister Crystal, one of the students' wives, who speaks she's like talking to a gringa. She speaks such good English, and her job, she translates back and forth for a business. But I said, "Am I saying this wrong?" She said, "No, it just sounds so funny to hear a gringo say it." So I said, "Okay." But they like that. So I was explaining to her about jeet yet, and she said, "What?" I said, "Do you know that Southern word yet, jeet yet?" She said, "No." And I said, "Think about it. Did you eat yet?" And she says, "Oh, okay." So it's always a wonderful trip. It's always difficult to leave, but no place like home. All that is also to say, if I say something just completely crazy, I'm extremely tired. So if I do, somebody just say, "What? Hang on, Chad," because I've already caught myself a couple times this morning and was finishing up my handouts to print, and I just put some weird references that were totally wrong, and I thankfully went back and caught it, and I think I got all those cleaned up, but apparently my mind's not firing on all cylinders this morning. I guess that's just fatigue. We left off last week talking about the call of Moses. We've been reviewing kind of an overview of Hebrew history to see how we got to where we are. We left off with the division of the kingdom, of course, but we're reviewing how we got there. God calls Moses, who Moses, of course, 80 years old. He's in the desert. He has a wife now and a child. And this is the man who 40 years earlier, he says, "It's me, God. I'm God's man. He's going to use me to deliver the children of Israel." He was right. He was just about 40 years too early. And so, God tells Moses, he doesn't tell him, but Moses had to go out and mature a little bit. Seems he needed to learn some humility. Which, of course, happens because later on in Numbers, we're going to be told in Numbers 12, he's the meekest man upon the face of the earth. So God calls Moses, and now the man who was so gung-ho earlier says, no, Lord, it's not me. And, of course, he uses all these excuses, send somebody else. That was kind of the final straw. He just send anybody else, Lord. He says, I'm nobody. I'm not a good public speaker. He's got all these different excuses, and then finally he said, "Look, just send somebody else." And God says, "No, Moses, you're the man for the job." So he finally goes, tells Pharaoh, "Let my people go," or "Thus saith the Lord of Israel, let my people go." Pharaoh's response was, "I don't know your God, and I'm sure not letting these people go." Over in Romans, Paul's going to talk about this, and sometimes people think it's an illustration of unconditional election, the Calvinistic idea of unconditional election, that God had chosen Pharaoh to be lost before time ever began. There was nothing that could change that. It's not. Pharaoh had a choice. But what Paul is saying over in Romans 9 is, either way, God is glorified. God raised up Pharaoh to glorify his name. But Pharaoh had a choice. Because if Pharaoh says no, God's going to be glorified, because he says, if you say no, I will bring you to your knees. You will let these people go. You can do it the easy way, or you can do it the hard way. But if Pharaoh had chosen to say yes, God's name is still glorified. I mean, can you imagine that spreading throughout the world, that an entire nation just let a whole other nation basically of slaves just walk free? They just turn loose all their slaves? Why would anybody do that? Well, you see, Jehovah said so. Who's Jehovah? Well, let me tell you, he's the God of heaven and earth. God's name is glorified either way. Unfortunately, Pharaoh chose the hard way. He says, "No, I don't know your God, not letting these people go." And so, of course, the 10 plagues proceeded to begin. Each time Pharaoh hardening his heart. A couple of times he seemed like he was going to soften up a little bit. Well, okay. And he just continued to be stubborn. So finally, the death of the firstborn, the 10th plague. And Pharaoh says, "Just go." Of course, a couple times before he'd say, "Well, you can go, but leave the little ones here. You can go, but leave the livestock here." And one of those famous expressions, Moses on one occasion tells Pharaoh, "Not a hoof shall be left behind." This is not a bargaining session. This is, you will unconditionally surrender, because Jehovah is the God of heaven and earth. And of course, you've probably heard other preachers point out each of those plagues was a judgment against the gods of Egypt to show that their gods were no gods. But the death of the firstborn, and so he says, "Go, just get out." And of course, as per usual, he changes his mind, and he begins to chase them into the desert. They come to the Red Sea. You've got desert on either side. You've got the sea in front. You've got the Egyptian army behind, and the children of Israel began to panic. Moses makes that well-known statement, "Be still." and see the salvation of the Lord. And so God saves them. He parts the Red Sea. They walk across on dry land. When they get across, of course, Pharaoh and his army just, and I've often wondered about that. Have you ever thought about that? If you're Pharaoh's army, you get to the Red Sea, it's parted. There's a wall of water here, a wall of water there, and there's dry land. Even though I watched them cross, I mean, don't you think you'd be a little bit hesitant? Like, this isn't normal. You think that's safe for us just to go in there? And it seems like at least that they didn't think twice about it. They should have, but they didn't, or at least no indication that they did. They go in, and of course the waters come back, and the whole Egyptian army is drowned. Israel begins marching, and you get to, they come to Mount Sinai, and they begin to receive the law of Moses. The Ten Commandments, yes, but also the law of Moses. That was a small portion of this greater law of Moses. There was a lot to the law of Moses. Sometimes we want to separate the Ten Commandments from the law of Moses. It was part of the bigger law of Moses. And when the law of Moses is nailed to the cross, so are the Ten Commandments. So they received the Ten Commandments and the law there at Mount Sinai. Does anybody remember how long are they at Mount Sinai? Moses was up on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. How long was the nation there? I think somebody said it about 1 year. It's right at a year, a little more, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. They're there. They received the law. The tabernacle's built. And of course, the latter part of you have the giving of the Ten Commandments as the beginning of that law there in Exodus 20, and really the better part, just about the rest of Exodus. I think it does start about chapter 21 through the end of the book, are instructions for the tabernacle. Very meticulous instructions of how God wants them to make the tabernacle. So the tabernacle's built. The whole book of Leviticus takes place at Mount Sinai. It's during that 1 year. The tabernacle's built. Of course, chapter 10 is sort of the, it's not exactly parallel, but I sometimes use the expression it's kind of the grand opening of the tabernacle, and I don't mean that flippantly. I'm just saying it's the first time it was used. They went, God gave very meticulous instructions. It was an absolutely fantastic, astounding structure. It was portable. Everything about it was made so that it could be packed up and carried with them as they go through the wilderness, but also so much that was, covered in gold or made out of pure gold. It was an amazing thing to behold, no doubt. All this goes into it. God has special men that He gives gifts. He places in them the knowledge to make all these different things. And then you get to Leviticus 10, and now it's time to utilize the tabernacle. And what happens? Nadab and Abihu decide, instead of taking fire from where God said to take it, they take strange fire, unauthorized fire. They took it from somewhere else. Why? I don't know. I think the text probably gives us a good indication. When Moses forbids priests from drinking alcohol, I think they probably, you have to be careful not to say that 100% for sure, but I think it's a pretty strong indication there that probably they were in some way or another intoxicated. It impaired their judgment. So they did this. Fire went out from the Lord, destroyed them. But yeah, about 1 year at Sinai. So that's the whole book of Leviticus. You come to Numbers. They finally leave Mount Sinai. Of course, Numbers opens and closes with what? The census. Hence the name, Numbers. That's why we call it Numbers, because there's a census in the beginning of the book, there's a census at the end. In the beginning of the book, it's, I think it's like 603,550, something like that. A little over 600,000 men. This is not counting Levites. This is not counting men who were too old to go to war, too young to go to war. No. It was 20 years old and up, sorry. It's not counting the younger ones. It's not counting the Levites, and of course not counting the women. So many scholars estimate this was easily a congregation or a nation of of well over 1 million people at this time. So they do the census. God says, time to move. So the cloud, of course, He led them in a cloud, a pillar of cloud in the daytime, and at night it was a pillar of fire. The cloud moves, and when the cloud moved, they moved. So they pack up and they go. You get to Numbers 13. Moses, at God's instruction, sends 12 spies. 12 spies into the land of Canaan. Check out the land, bring us back a report. They come back, of course, the long and short of it is they say it's just as great. It's greater than God said it would be, that Moses has told us. Unbelievable, amazing, but there are giants in the land. We can't take it. There's no way. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. They're just gonna stomp us and squish us. Giants in the land, we can't take it. 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, stood up and they said, no. If the Lord delights in us, he'll give us this land. This is God's doing. It's not on us. But don't rebel against God. Don't disbelieve God. And unfortunately, the congregation listened to the 10 unfaithful spies. And so God says, okay, you say you can't take the land. You say you're not going to go in the land. You say you're going to die in the wilderness. Guess what? You're not going to take the land. You're not going to go in the land, and you are going to die in this wilderness. 40 years, a year for each day the spies were gone spying out the land. You are going to wander in the wilderness until that entire generation of unbelievers dies out, with the exception of 2 people, Joshua and Caleb, because they were the faithful ones. And so the younger generation, he says, your children that you said we're going to just die out here in the wilderness, they're going to inherit the promised land. You're not. Those were the consequences of their action, of their unbelief. So they wander for 40 years, and that's really the better part of the book of Judges, is the wilderness wanderings and the constant, sometimes we call Judges the book of what? Anybody remember this? What happens over and over and over in Judges? You're thinking of Judges, or did I say Judges? I told you it was coming. Yeah, that's absolutely right, Brother Allen, and we'll get to that. I'm sorry, that's my bad. I told you it was going to happen. I knew it would. Numbers. What happens over and over again in the book of Numbers? Murmuring, complaining. They're constantly complaining during this wilderness wandering. Oh, they don't like this. We don't have water. We don't have food. Oh, we can't stand this manna. We're so sick of it. I mean, it's just over and over and over. And so there's a lot of accounts of that. You have the rebellion of Korah, the rebellion of his own brother, Aaron and Miriam, in Numbers chapter 12. And that's where we're told that Moses was the meekest man above all who were upon the face of the earth. You have the brazen serpents when they murmured there. The serpents came and bit them, and they were dying from that. And God told Moses to make a brazen serpent. That's Numbers 21. All these different times where they're murmuring. God was not hasty in his judgment. They were constantly rebelling and murmuring, complaining. Finally, toward the end of the book of Numbers, you see this younger generation, or this older generation, has just about died out, and they start to take some land on, we call it the Transjordan. It's, when you're looking at a map, it's the east side of Jordan. And then you come to Deuteronomy. What is Deuteronomy in a nutshell? It's the second giving of the law. Deutero, second. Nomos, Greek words. Nomos, which means lost. It's not the second law. It's just the second giving of the law. It's like a repeat of the law for this newer generation. Sometimes I've read that before, and I think, okay. And I was teaching students this past week on expository preaching, and one of the things that you want to ask, really with any text, period, but especially if you're working up a sermon on that text, an expository sermon especially, but you want to ask, why is this here? So why would God put a repeat of the law in for us? And I think we could give a number of reasons, but I think primarily because people forget, don't they? We forget too easily. And here they are on the very cusp of entering into the promised land, and Moses, or God through Moses, says, let's go over this one more time, because I know you're going to get in the land and you're going to forget. In fact, he says that in the book of Deuteronomy. You're going to get in there, you're going to get full, you're going to have houses you didn't build, vineyards you didn't plant, and everything's going to be going great, and you're going to forget God. He says, I'm warning you. And no doubt some heeded the warnings, but by and large they didn't. And so he repeats the law in the book of Deuteronomy. When you get to Joshua, they began the conquest proper into the land of Canaan. And that's what Joshua was all about, entering into the land, conquering the land. Jericho, of course, being the first fruits. Achan took of the spoils. Once they narrowed it down to Achan and figured out, okay, he's the one who took the spoils, now we're going to, they come out as his punishment. They stoned him. Before that, 40, I think it was 40 men lost their lives at Ai. Now they go and they pick up, and from after Joshua 7, the conquest really is rolling, and they're trusting in God. Joshua takes the leadership. Of course, also in the book of Numbers, chapter 20, I didn't mention this, Moses had the one incident where God tells him to speak to the rock, and he struck the rock instead. And because of that, God says, Moses, you didn't believe me. You're not going to enter into the land of Canaan. By the way, there's an interesting point there. On another occasion, and memory serves me correctly, this was actually in Exodus. On one occasion previous, they needed water, and God told Moses to strike the rock. On this occasion, he said, speak to it. So, do details matter? They certainly do. Moses says, here now, you rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock when you get to Numbers 20? And that's where the unbelief seems to be. And it seems to be born out of frustration and anger. But nevertheless, God says, Moses, because you did this, you're not going to enter into the promised land. In the book of Judges, I'm stuck on Judges this morning. In the book of Deuteronomy, there's a section, a little spot there where Moses speaks to God about this. And it's almost like a child when mom says no to something. And you say, but please, can we please change this? I'm sorry. And sometimes when I was growing up, I'd go to apologize to mom, and it wasn't always just to get out of punishment. Sometimes I genuinely was sorry. Sometimes it was just to get out of, or to try to get out of punishment. But you go and you say, I know I messed up, Mom, and I'm sorry. And I remember many times Mom was saying, well, Chad, I appreciate that. And I'm glad you see that. You're still not going on that trip this weekend. You're still not going to the movies tonight or whatever. And, that was your punishment. And that's how it was with Moses. It's like he's saying to God, please, can I've learned my lesson. Can I go into the promised land? And at one point, God says, don't speak to me anymore about this. You ever have to do that with your children? I've had my mom many a time say that to me. She'd say, you're still not going. I'd say, well, come on, please. And she'd say, enough. Don't talk to me anymore about this, or you're going to be in further trouble. So God tells Moses, don't talk to me anymore about this. Of course, takes him up Mount Nebo. And Brother Hayner, I still have the sermon in Espanol. But when I finally sit down and translate it, I want to preach it, because Hayner did a sermon in February of this year when we were in Costa Rica. We got to go, actually that might have been last year's trip, last February. But he did a sermon called What Moses Saw from Mount Nebo. And it was fantastic. He talks about he saw the consequences of sin and the culmination of life. It was alliterated even in Spanish. And I told him, I said, man, you got to appreciate a sermon that'll alliterate in 2 languages. So God takes Moses up to Mount Nebo and shows him the promised land. Of course, when Moses died and he wakes up in paradise, no doubt he thought, this is the promised land. Hebrews 4:9, there remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. He says the promised land, physical, Canaan, that was not the true promised land. It was a shadow. The substance, the real promised land is heaven. Joshua takes the leadership, leads them in. They conquer the land of Canaan. That's really basically the whole book of Joshua. You get to the end of the book of Joshua, and Joshua he knows he's not much longer for this earth. And so he gathers the elders of Israel, he gathers the congregation of Israel, and he addresses them in that famous statement in the last chapter, Joshua 24:15, choose you this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He says, you got to make a choice. When you get to the book of Judges, and we're finally there to Judges, and now I can say Judges and be right, and I probably won't say another book. But Judges is all about, as Brother Allen pointed out earlier, it's all about this cycle of Israel. They fall away from God. They turn away, they serve other gods, which really happened because they didn't do exactly what God said. God told them to drive out the inhabitants of the land of Canaan utterly. Why? It's one word: sin. And more particularly, idolatry. He says they are idolatrous. They had all this time to repent. God had devoted special attention to the nation of Israel, and he will throughout the Old Testament. Not because they're greater. That's also in Deuteronomy. I think it's about 5. It's either 5, 6, or 7. He'll make the point. God didn't set his affections on you because you're the greatest. You've shown yourself to be stiff-necked, stubborn, rebellious, complainers. God didn't set his affections on you because you were look what a numerous, large nation this is. He said you were the smallest of the nations. But God made a promise to Abraham. He didn't neglect the Gentiles, though. They had instruction. They had no excuse. And Paul talks about this in Romans 1, by the way. They became idolatrous. Not only that, they had an extra 40 years to get right. And they didn't. And so God tells the Israelites, you go in there and you drive them out utterly. This is my judgment upon those nations. If you leave them, number one, you're disobeying God. Number two, they're going to be a thorn in your side. They're going to turn your heart away from God. And boy, didn't that come to pass. And so they in the book of Judges, they would turn away from God, worship those idols, and because of that, God would say, okay. And the nations would afflict them, persecute them. They would suffer, sometimes shorter time, sometimes longer time, and then they would cry out, God, we know we have sinned. And so they would repent, turn back to God. Please help us. And then God would send a judge. Or again, you may remember when we actually studied the book of Judges, we said it was probably a better term, or more familiar for us would be to think of them as a champion. God sent a champion, a deliverer. And this person may or may not be a spiritual leader. Sometimes they were, but then you had some that were very foolish in many ways spiritually, like Samson. But they would go and they would just inflict casualties upon the enemies of God's people, to deliver God's people. And again, as a judgment against those idolatrous people. And over again, you see this cycle in the book of Judges. The opening of the book says, a new generation arose, which knew not God, nor the mighty works which he had done for Israel. Why did they not know God? I think probably the best explanation is that repeat of the law in Deuteronomy. You remember in chapter 6, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. And these statutes which I teach you this day shall be in your heart. You'll teach them to your children when you lie down, when you rise up, when you sit down, when you're walking in the way. There'll be signs upon your hands, frontlets between your eyes. In other words, it's an ongoing conversation you're having with your children, with each other, where you're teaching and telling them about the Lord. Somewhere along the way that stopped. So now you have a generation that doesn't know God. Sometimes people say, well, I've heard a sermon on this. I've heard a Bible class lesson on this. Why do we repeat stuff? That's why. So now you got these people, and so that's the cycle of Judges. It's just really a 4-part cycle. Sin, oppression, repentance, deliverance. And it's repeated over and over again. By the way, I mentioned this in the class, but sometimes those judges overlap in time. Sometimes people look at it and they say, you can't make the years work with all these different judges and how long each one judged Israel. Sometimes they were overlapping. Sometimes these were regional judges. You got one judge over here who's a champion in delivering God's people from oppression over here. Another one over here that's a champion in delivering God's people from oppression over here. And they're at the same time. That's a good question. I don't remember. We talked about. We don't know for sure. We talked about. Some people think that it could have been Samuel, and I think that's, if I recall, and I'm saying this without having looked at my introductory notes for Judges, but as I recall, I think that, does anybody remember from talking about Judges? I think we may have settled on that was the best option. He is the most logical choice. But we don't know for sure. So, so that's the period of Judges. You get, and really Judges is summed up by, what is it, chapter 16, 13? Is that the verse I'm thinking of? No, not at all. Anyways, it's repeated twice in Judges. I know where the other one is. It's in chapter 21. I don't know why I thought 16, 13. 21, 23, I believe is it. No, it's not. 21, 25. I told you. Struggle fest today. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. That's Judges in a verse right there. There's no king. People are just kind of doing their own thing. And boy, the last few chapters of Judges, some of it is happening chronologically, and it seems to be more of a historical account, but it's after Samson, as I recall. Samson goes through what, chapter 16? I think it's after Samson. We called these the appendices. Yeah, chapters 17 through 21 are kind of like appendices saying, hey, here's an illustration. You want to see how rough things were in Israel in those days? How everybody's just doing what's right in his own sight? Let me give you Exhibit A and Exhibit B. Here's this fella, Micah, who decides he's just going to be his own priest and have his own little homemade religion. And he hires a priest later on, and then the priest gets stolen away from him. It's just, everybody's just doing what's right in their own eyes. And the Gibeonites, or Benjamites, sorry, all of that, these are just exhibits showing just how depraved Israel had become at this point. That's the dark spot in their history. Of course, you come to Ruth, that's the bright spot in the midst of the darkness, because Ruth shows herself to be faithful. Ruth, Naomi, and of course this is also tying in with the seed line of the Messiah, because Ruth marries Boaz, Boaz begat Obed, Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David, the king of Israel. You get to 1 Samuel, you got a lady named Hannah. She can't have any children. She prays and prays and prays for a son. Samuel comes to her, not Samuel, Eli comes to her and says, your prayers have been answered. You're going to have a son. And so she has a son, and she names him what? She names him Asked of God, because she asked for him from God, and God answered her prayer. So Samuel asked of God. So she has a son. She names him Samuel. A few chapters later, Samuel's sons are not following him. Of course, God sends a rebuke through Samuel for Eli, who didn't discipline his sons. Doesn't seem to be the same with Samuel. Samuel is not rebuked for his sons, but his sons are not faithful. And so the people come to him and they say, look, you're old. You're not going to be on this earth much longer, Samuel. And your sons, they're wicked. They don't follow God. So what do they say? Give us a king. Why was that their answer? I don't know. Well, I do know, at least in part. They want to be like everybody else. And so Samuel says, God through Samuel says, you don't know what you're asking for, but you've asked for it. So what's the old expression? You better be careful what you ask for sometimes, because you just might get it. Brother Bland used to tell us he prayed for patience and said, God gave me teenagers. So they say, we want a king. We want to be like everybody else. God says, okay, you asked. You're going to get it. So he gives them Saul. Saul starts out as a good king. He ends up offering a sacrifice, which he was unauthorized to do. He's from the tribe of Benjamin, not from the tribe of Levi. That's chapter 13. You get to chapter 15. He's sent on a simple, very clear mission to destroy the Amalekites. He saves the best of the flocks. He saves the king. And at that point, Samuel says, God has spoken. He's done. Your kingdom. In fact, Samuel turns to leave, and Saul reaches out and says, wait. And Samuel's garment tears. And Samuel turns around and says, that's a symbol. God's torn the kingdom from you, Saul. And so the kingdom was taken from him and given to David. Samuel anointed the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. David wasn't king for a long time, though, right? Saul continued to pursue him, trying to kill him. Saul could have repented. He would have lost the kingdom, but he could have been right with God. He traded an eternity in heaven for trying to stop the will of God, which he couldn't stop anyways. It's really one of the most tragic accounts in the Bible. But he continues to try to pursue David and kill him. And, of course, God is helping David. God protects David. David not perfect by any stretch, but he behaves himself in a godly way. Finally, he's set up on the throne. David rules for 40 years. Saul ruled for 40 years. A lot goes on in David's life. That's a little closer to where we left off, so I won't go into great detail with that. But, of course, a lot of problems with his family because of the sin with Bathsheba. That was one of the consequences. A rebellion from Absalom that had to be dealt with. And finally, David established his throne, and, of course, then later on he dealt with the rebellion from Absalom, reestablishes his throne, has a little bit more family trouble because he's got a son that wants to usurp the throne, and he has to kind of make a statement and anoint, you want to say Samuel, Solomon as king. Solomon will also reign 40 years. It's very easy when you think about the first three kings of Israel, 40, 40, 40, as far as the years of their reigns. Solomon becomes king. And just like God said, they left those people in the land, and Solomon, man, he was enamored with women. And he had all those wives, all those concubines. And the Bible says in chapter 11 of, I believe that's 2 Samuel. No, 1 Kings. That they turned his heart away from God. I believe, we've talked about this, I hope and believe that the book of Ecclesiastes is kind of an open letter of repentance from Solomon. It seems he learned better before he left this life. He says in chapter 12, this is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. All through the book he's saying, I tried riches. I tried finding happiness, true joy and happiness in riches. I tried it in fame. I tried to find it with women, all these different things. And he says, all this is vanity. And gets to the end and he says, fear God and keep his commandments. That's what life is all about. You want to be truly happy? You fear God and keep his commandments. But boy, Solomon is a case study in what will happen and how easily a spouse or someone in that close a relationship can turn your heart away from God. Solomon becomes unfaithful, and because of that, even though I said I believe Ecclesiastes is an open letter of repentance, but there are still consequences, right? One of the consequences of his sins was the kingdom was going to be rent, torn from him, and more particularly from his descendants. And so where we left off is Rehoboam takes over. And they come to him and they say, make life easier on us and we'll serve you. The older men said, do it. Solomon made things pretty hard on them, which is exactly what Samuel told the nation your king would do, right? You recall? But he says, do it, they'll serve you. That's what the older men said. The younger men said, I tell them, you ain't seen nothing. And so foolishly he listened to the younger men. And so the kingdom splits. Jeroboam becomes king over the north, and he's going to set up idolatrous worship, which we'll talk about next week, Lord willing. And that's going to continue for every single king in the northern kingdom. And the kingdom is now divided, and many times they're going to fight each other, sadly, almost like a civil war. But that's where we left off. Now the kingdom has divided. Rehoboam has acted very foolishly. He didn't listen to the young men, or he didn't listen to the older men. But this also is partly because God said that's a consequence of Solomon's sins. The kingdom would divide. Well, sometimes you just can't stop the flood. The young'uns are coming in. But that takes us up to where we left off. Lord willing, we'll pick up with the dividing of the kingdom and start studying the history going forward from there next week. Thank you very much. We'll have a break before our worship period. Come on in.